Dismissed for children's church. I remembered. I have put in the bulletin even too. We have a privilege of, as they're leaving here, having Dr. Holmes with us again today, and we will next week as well. And Dr. Holmes received his 20-year service award last week from Grace University, and he is the academic dean, is that correct? And does teach Old Testament as well. So it's a privilege to have you here again. Thank you.
Cuidados amigo, lápiz número dos. It's the only Spanish I know. It says, be careful, my friend, number 2 pencil. So if I go to Spain, I'm going to need some help. Anyway, there's a long story behind that, but we don't need to go into that. So, have you ever been disappointed? I imagine you have. It's part of the human condition. I've been disappointed. Today we're going to take a look at disappointment, dealing with disappointment. We're in Judges and Ruth. I'm here 3 weeks, and we're taking a look at what I want to call the Bethlehem trilogy. There's 3 stories that Bethlehem plays a very central role in. The first story last week, we saw that Micah was lost and ran after money, and Jonathan, Moses' grandson, neglects his Levitical heritage, and he's running around looking for money. They were lost. Remember the mission, abilities, priorities? They had no clue. And so the story in the text, when they leave Bethlehem, everything just fell apart. And today, it's interesting how the narrative, Judges chapter 19, another Levite leaves Bethlehem, and another disaster ensues. Next week, we see people returning to Bethlehem, and there's hope. So it's kind of where we're going, where we're at in this story. So, Judges 19. We're gonna start here with last week, this week. Yeah, this week we're going to take a look at a concubine from Bethlehem. She's raped and killed, not by evil foreigners, but by Israelites. So that should cause us to scratch our head and go, whoa, wait a minute. Yeah, all right. So here we go. Judges chapter 19, verse 1, the first 5 verses up there or so. In those days, Israel had no king. That's the theme of Judges, so there's just anarchy running around. There's a Levite living temporarily in the remote region of Ephraimite hill country, and he acquired a concubine from Bethlehem. However, she was unfaithful to him. Some translations say she got angry at him. But anyway, in either case, the relationship was strained. So she went home to her father's house in Bethlehem. So she goes home in Bethlehem. When she'd been there 4 months, her husband came after her. I'm thinking, where's he been for 4 months? But okay. And he went after her, hoping he could convince her to return. He brought with him his servant and a pair of donkeys. So it looks like he's expecting to take her home. When she brought him into her father's house, the girl's father saw him and greeted him warmly. Yeah, can you imagine the social pressure of having your daughter just run home? The marriage is stressed. So in this culture where shame is a very important deal, it's important to this father to have this relationship patched up. And so that's probably one of the reasons why he's happy to see the husband come back. All right, concubine. You know, we're reading here, there's a Levite that has a concubine. Now, those words, we don't use Levites and concubines in our everyday language. You know, you don't go to Walmart and, anyway. So just imagine if I'm telling a story, you know, a pastor friend of mine in North Carolina and his second wife, they went, surfing the other day. You should be like, what? Your pastor has a second wife? What? That's odd. Yeah, that's what we should think. And so when we read the text and we say a Levite has a second wife, we should go, well, time out. That's odd. Levites were called to a very holy profession, serving the Lord. They should be holy. And we know from Genesis that it's one man, one woman. That's the plan. So we have here a Levite who is already pushing the boundaries. He has a second wife. And so we, right off the bat, we're alerted to the fact that things are not well. So anyway, a concubine was a secondary wife, not like a slave, but not the freedom of a primary wife. And how it worked was a secondary wife would actually live with her father, and then the husband would visit her now and then her children could actually end up becoming heirs of the estate and inherit things. Eventually, that wife could be promoted to a better status, still a secondary wife called a concubine. And she would be moved to a separate place where the husband would maybe travel and visit now and then. And he would support her and give her money and stuff. It's different. All right, today's talk, there's a lot of different things going on. I'm going to have to hold your hand and walk you through. But anyway, that's what a concubine is, in case you're wondering. All right. And there's a lot of illustrations about how that doesn't really work out well in the Old Testament. The next section here, verses 4 to 10, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but here's the deal. It's kind of creepy, all right? It's what I call creepy hospitality. The story goes on. So the girl goes back home, and the girl's father talks to this guy. Oh, just stay here, just stay and eat. And oh, it's already noon. Just stay another night. Okay. The next night, well, just stay another night. Okay. And as I read this, I'm uncomfortable. I'm like, this is just weird. Just keep staying there. You know what I mean? 4 days, 5 days, but the fifth day, he's like, I'm gone. I'm out of here. I can't deal with this anymore. He doesn't really say that, but anyway. He says, look, the day's almost over, and the man didn't want to stay another night, so he left, and he went to Jebus. Jebus is the name for Jerusalem before David conquered it. David conquered it in 2 Samuel chapter 5, probably crawling up through a water hole that I've seen, Warren Shaft. It's kind of cool. You been there? Some people? That's cool. Good memory. So anyway, that's what Jebus is. So, but at this time, this is not an Israelite city. All right? And the servant, I'll go on here. I think I'll pick it up here. Yeah. They got near Jebus, and the servant says to his master, hey, let's stay here at Jebus. The master said, no, we're not staying at a foreign city because there's no Israelites there. We will go on to Gibeah. The expectation. Okay, today's talk is on disappointment. One of the things I'm going to try to bring out is that expectations are often linked to our disappointments. Here the expectation is we will be treated better in an Israelite town than if we just stay at Jebus, which is not an Israelite town. This expectation is going to blow up. Think about expectations, right? You ever go to a movie with just, you've heard this is the greatest movie ever, and you go to it and you're like, what are they thinking? Because your expectations are so high. Otherwise, you don't know what to do, and then this failed, and that, your schedule's such, you go to, let's just go to a movie, and zero expectations. That was great. See, so my secret to life is very low expectations. I'm telling you, that's where it's at, okay? Anyway, not really. But we do see a link between expectations and disappointment. He said to his servant, we'll go to one of the towns, Gibeah. So they traveled on. And look at this, in verse 14. They traveled on. The sun went down when they were near Gibeah. That means they're on the road at night. It's dark. They have nowhere to stay. Okay? You ever been traveling at night, nowhere to stay? A little intimidating. They need help. Verse 15. Verse 15 is a bombshell. They stopped and decided to spend the night in Gibeah. They came to the city and sat down on the town square, but no one invited them in. Now, you might read this, you're like, okay, so big deal, whatever. No, in this culture, this is a major sociological faux pas, problem, error, oversight, all right? I'm gonna spend quite a bit of time on sharing with you hospitality in that culture, and it is so hard to understand. It is so difficult to understand. You're just going to have to trust me and just take a leap of faith and say, okay, that's just the way it was back then, and we go on, because you will not understand it. I don't understand it, but it's just the way it was, all right? So, verse 15, in any ancient Near Eastern country would be a problem. When a stranger comes to a village, sits at the town square, nobody extends him a greeting, that would be a major problem in any culture of this era. But that it's a Levite in an Israelite town, it makes it all the more egregious. I like the word egregious. Okay. So, and I will uncover these as we go on, but the first observation is that disappointment reminds us we're not in control. These people are traveling. It's nighttime. They can't control how the city welcomes them. They can't make other people do anything. You know, teaching and preaching, sometimes they get questions, how can I make so-and-so do this? How can I make my husband do that? How can I make my wife do that? And you're like, hey, you can't make them do anything. You know what I mean? Pray. Anyway, so control, number one, we can't control everything. Number two, disappointment is often linked to expectations. Here, they expected to be treated better in an Israelite town. And we're going to see that didn't work out. And where we're going to end up today is the real observation that Jesus never disappoints. If we take our disappointment to him, he never disappoints. All right? So that's kind of where we're going. However, that last point, and stay there, take your disappointment to Jesus and stay there, what do we mean by that? Here's what I mean. Disappointment can take you down or up. It can take you up to Christ. You might have a broken heart, but you're taking your disappointment to him, and you're willing to walk through that. Or it can take you down into bitterness. And here's a tragic story from David's life. Do you realize last words can be important? Someone's last words. I've read about Pancho Villa, some Mexican bandit guy. His last words were something like, tell them, or think of something good to say. Don't tell them it ended like this. I mean, that's his last words. Just make something up. Okay, look at David's last words here. This is a little story. In 2 Samuel 16, David is traveling, and there's this guy from Saul's family named Shemaiah. And he's yelling at David as David is walking. And this is what he's yelling. Leave, leave, you man of bloodshed, you wicked man. The Lord has punished you for the blood you spilt in the house of Saul, in whose place you rule. Now the Lord has given your kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. Disaster has overtaken you. You're a man of bloodshed. One of David's guys was like, let me go kill him for you. I'll go kill him. And David's like, no. David says, leave him alone so that he can curse, for the Lord has spoken to him. Perhaps the Lord will notice my affliction and grant me good in the place of his curse. So David and his men went on their way, but Shimei kept going along the side of the hill opposite him, yelling curses at him, throwing stones and dirt at them. You know how exhausting that would be? Anyway, he finally got to the place exhausted. So it's a happy ending, right? This is great. So David, wow, self-control. This guy's throwing dirt at him and yelling at him. He's like, no, just the Lord has spoken to him, and we'll just let it roll. It's all good, except we see that a seed of disappointment, which turned into revenge, was planted, and it festered for 10, 20, 30 years. Because in 1 Kings 2, David is dying. These are his last words, King David. Note well, you still have to contend with Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Baruim, who tried to call down on me a horrible curse of judgment. He came down and met me at the Jordan. I solemnly promised him by the Lord, I will not strike you down with the sword. But now, he's telling his servant here, don't treat him as if he were innocent. You are a wise man. You know how to handle him. Make sure he has a bloody death. And then David passed away. What? Wow. Did you know those were David's last words? Isn't that tragic? That seed of disappointment festered like a splinter in your hand. We were working on some houses last summer, and I had a splinter for like 2 months. It was super deep, and I tried cutting and hacking, and it was just making a mess. I just said forget it. And eventually they pop out. But they fester. So here's a situation where David did not take his disappointment to his God. We want to take our disappointment to Jesus Christ and unload that and forgive. Forgiveness is one of those things when we forgive, we're the ones that are set free. Even if the other person doesn't ask for forgiveness, they may completely be oblivious to the fact that there's any issue. We can go to them and say, I forgive you. Don't ask for permission. I'm doing this. I'm forgiving you for X, Y, and Z, and just want to let you know that. They might look at you cross-eyed and like, what are you smoking? But this is what I need to do to maintain. Anyway, so that's what's going on there. Let's go on with our story here, chapter 19, verse 16. So the context here, they didn't stay at Jebus, foreign city. They're going to move on to Gibeah because it'll be better. So now they're at Gibeah, and an old man passed by, returning at the end of the day from his work in the field. The man was from Ephraim, hill country, living temporarily in Gibeah. That's very important. So, this guy, he's not from this area. He's from another part of the region, but he's just temporarily here. This is a Benjamite area. He looked up and saw the traveler, and he said, where are you heading? Where do you come from? Now, I think it's interesting he doesn't say, who are you? I'm wondering here, I'm going to have to wonder out loud about this narrative in this text. Levites had a distinctive dress, some haircut haircut issues, so I'm thinking that perhaps just visually, he knows he's a Levite. But he doesn't say, who are you? He just says, where are you going? So perhaps, I don't know. The Levite said, I'm traveling from Bethlehem to a remote region of Ephraim. That's where I'm from. I had business. And I came here and no one welcomed me in. We have enough grain for our donkeys. We have food and wine and everything and the servants. So we lack nothing. We're not going to be burdened to anybody. And the old man said, it's okay. Everything's fine. Now this is what the old man says. Whatever you do, don't stay here in the open square. So you get a sense that like the part of the movie where it's dark and creepy, the music gets a little tense. That's the part of this scene right here. Is like, just don't stay in the square. Just come with me. Okay. So they do that. They wash their feet, had a meal. Now this is where we need to take a little side journey into some hospitality issues. Okay. Hospitality in the ancient A&E, ancient Near East. Okay, that's what's going on up here. Everyone had a nomadic lifestyle, and you're traveling across the desert, you're traveling great distances. You had the right to expect any foreigner, any stranger, to welcome you in and just give you food. I can't remember last week if I told you about Wheelwall, the guy from Sudan. I was backpacking. That great, enough of you can't remember, so I'll say it again. It might have been someone else. I lead backpacking trips to Grace, and we go to Colorado, backpack for a couple days, and this one guy was from Sudan. Never seen snow, never backpack, and it snowed 2 inches that night. The only time in about 10 years that it snowed. So we're making pancakes in the snow, and I'm talking to him. I'm like, so in Sudan, when you travel, do you have backpacks? Oh, no backpacks. Do you have food, stoves? No. Why do you do that? Oh, we just walk to a village, and then someone lets us stay with them. Like a relative? No, anybody. So they just walk into a town, very much like this culture. They just walk into a town, and they stand there, and someone says, hey, come stay with us. And that's what they do. I thought, what a great way to travel. You don't need a backpack. You don't need food. So, but there's other disadvantages of Sudan. But anyway. Okay. So you get the sense here that hospitality in this culture is a very, very common, it's expected, the nomadic lifestyle, okay? It was a sacred duty. It was part of the expectations. You know, the Greeks thought that hospitality was a decisive mark of culture. The civilized were called those who love strangers and fear the gods. Zeus was called a friend of strangers. Egypt thought that if you were hospitable, you would gain a better afterlife. Romans thought that it was a sacred obligation. So just the culture, it's just part of their culture, okay? It was commanded, Leviticus said, when you see a stranger, treat him with kindness, don't do him wrong. Deuteronomy, love the sojourner. A sojourner is just a guy out wandering around, like a homeless person, okay? You were poor and wandering around in the land of Egypt. This next section of verses here, I love this because it's, look what it says. When you reap in your field and you forget a sheaf or a bundle of grain, you forget don't go back and get it. Leave it there for the poor person. Isn't that interesting? How many times do you drop $20 and you lose $20 that you don't go back into Best Buy to find it? You're like, oh, I'm just going to leave it for poor people. We just don't think that way. It's ours, right? Okay. When you reap in your field, you forget a sheaf. I said that already. Okay. When you beat your olive trees, don't go over them again. You're leaving the extra for the poor people. Okay. When you gather grapes with your vineyard, don't strip it afterwards. Whatever's left over is for the sojourner. So the whole point here is that God seems to be very concerned, and he seems to view abundance spilling over to care for the sojourners, to care for the poor people, care for the homeless. Interesting model, okay? So hospitality was commanded, that you're supposed to just be concerned and help those around you. It was expected. A lot of stories there. Abraham, the angels, you know, in Genesis 18, he invites them into his home, and Lot, Elijah. There's just a lot of examples of it. So we'll blast through that. Now this is the extent. This is where it gets a little interesting. Okay. In my research on this, I found this, and this is the part we just don't understand. A murderer would find protection in the tent of his host, even if the host were the victim's own son. So I'm telling my son about this. I'm like, so here's the deal. Someone kills me, and that murderer is traveling through, and he needs shelter and food. You give it to him. And we're like, you know what I mean? In our culture, we don't understand that. So I'm trying to help you understand in this culture that expectation of hospitality is so deeply ingrained, we would say, they transgress other sacred obligations for their cultural obligation of hospitality. That's how we would, okay? All right. Here, I just found this last week. This is kind of shocking. It's such a foreign way of thinking, we have a hard time of putting our heads around it, but check this out. The Center for Reproductive Rights, I just found this on the web 6 days ago. An extremist international abortion syndicate that is spearheading the anti-life push sent a letter last month to the United Nations on torture, claiming that church leaders in the pro-life movement have perpetuated torture by taking a stand against abortion. Yeah. Okay, they're saying that if you're opposing abortion, you're promoting torture. See, this is an example of something that's so twisted. You're like, did I hear you right? I don't get it. That's coming from a worldview and a culture that's so different, it's just hard to understand. Just like this hospitality thing, okay? Anyway, all right, moving on. Another interesting thing about hospitality is that there's no need to say thank you, because you're supposed to do this. You know, you have someone over, well, thank you very much, it was nice. No, none of that. It's like, see ya. I'm out of here. It's just what you expect, okay? Interesting. They wouldn't just, if you show up late at night, like in this story, the showing at night at Gibeah, the expectation for food is past because you're late. We'll give you shelter, but if you get there before the mealtime, lavish banquet, just the best of everything. Again, that's really not like our culture, you know what I mean? Just to spend a whole bunch of money on some person you don't even know that's going to be gone the next day. Different culture, okay? Social evolution of hospitality. Eventually, people said, there's a lot of people coming and going, just staying randomly. Why don't we have a place, a building, where they can go and stay there? So this is sort of the beginning of the inn model, okay? And even in Jesus' day, Jesus' parents, Joseph and Mary, thank you. Anyway, those two people, right? The kataluma, where they stayed, it was called a kataluma, probably, house on top and a little barn below, but it could have been the end result of people starting to centralize where guests stay. All right, the last one I'm going to talk about is retribution theology. Okay, Luke probably knows something about retribution theology. I enjoyed having Luke in class, so Zeke, I hope I get you in class. And Dakota, if you follow the Lord's will, you'll come too, right? Okay, anyway. So retribution theology, retribution is a way of thinking that if I do good, I'm blessed. And if I do anything bad, God smacks me. And you go backwards and you think, if you get a flat tire, I did something bad. God's punishing me. That's this thought, okay? This is how they think in this culture. And so here are some things that they think. According to this, Abraham was given a son because he was hospitable. See, he was hospitable to those he entertained, the three angels. Lot was spared from the destruction because he was hospitable, okay? Rahab was spared because she welcomed the guests, or the spies. So you see hospitality drives their thinking, all right? And to you and I, it really doesn't. According to the Jews, Micah, in this section last week, in spite of his idolatry, he was hospitable, so he was rewarded for that. So you have a deep-seated way of thinking about hospitality. All right, here's a contrast. Extreme hospitality of the girl's father, 5 days. Creepy hospitality, but hospitality. And where is it? It's in Bethlehem, okay? Then you have the lack of hospitality in an Israelite town, Benjamin. So Old Testament survey, you're looking down the road here, a couple books down the road. Where's the first king, Saul? Where does he come from? He comes from Benjamin, actually from this very city, Gibeah. So if you're reading the Old Testament through carefully, you get to Samuel, and you're like, blah, 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 Saul from Gibeah, Benjamin. You're like, well time out. Is this the place where this story? And so it kind of casts him in a negative light. We'll unpack that here in a second, all right? So the hospitality of a non-Gibeahite, remember the guy made very clear, I'm not from here, I'm from somewhere else, but I will show you kindness, because apparently nobody from Gibeah is showing anybody kindness. All right. So my whole point here is it seems to cast some tension between David and Saul. David's hometown is Bethlehem. Saul's hometown is Gibeah. So you've got this Bethlehem-Gibeah tension and, for lack of better terms, good king, bad king set up. All right? Interesting. So we get back to the story here, and no one's taken him in, and the guy says, you can stay with me. And that's interesting. So why the reluctance? I just back up, and you're like, well, what is the deal with Gibeah? Why do they not welcome this guy in? First off, it doesn't say, but it could be because he's visibly associated with Israel's God, Yahweh, and he's a Levite. Now, if the whole bunch of the people are devoted to wickedness, they're not going to want any representative of God to make them feel bad. You know? You ever been someplace and someone swears in your presence, they say, I'm sorry? And like, what, do I have a sign? Do not swear in my presence? Well, what is this? Well, just your presence. They know you're different. And so maybe this culture, they're like, we don't want this guy. No one take him in your home because you make us feel bad. We're devoted to shame and evil, and you're not, or at least we don't think you are. But so that could be one of the reasons why. So the disrespect he's receiving could be because of their disrespect for the Lord, and they're personifying that disrespect in a person who represents the Lord. I'm not thinking out loud here that could be something going on. Don't know. Anyway, and here we go. They were having a good time when suddenly some of the men of the city, some good-for-nothing Hebrew, good-for-nothings, surrounded the house, kept beating on the door. They said to the old man who owned the house, send the man out that came to visit you so we can have sex with him. The man who owned the house said he went outside and said to them, no, my brothers, I mean, that's not you vandals and, anyway, okay, brothers, don't do this wicked thing. And it's so good to see a man stand up for what's right. Don't do this wicked thing. After all this, the man is a guest of my house. Hospitality, right? See this hospitality thing? Now, this is where you have to at least remember that hospitality is the most important thing in this situation, according to them. Not according to God, but according to them. Don't do such a disgraceful thing. Here are my virgin daughter and this guy's wife. I'm going to send them out to you. You can abuse them all night and do whatever you want, but just don't do anything disrespectful to my guest. And this is the point where we cross our eyes and go, what in the world is going on? Because hospitality is more important than this one's life in that culture. Not before God, but in that culture. Culture has so twisted the values of God that if you grow up in this culture, you can't see straight. Just like the pictures up here of the little kids bowing down to Allah. They're growing up in a culture that they can't see straight without the Spirit of God and God dropping some Christian in their path to say, hey, there's another reality out there, okay? So these people are not able to see straight just because of the culture that they're in, and hospitality drives everything. It drives their view of God. It drives their view of what a man was. It drives their view of relationships. It's off the charts. The wicked men refused to listen to him, so the Levite grabbed his wife and made her go outside. The text is silent about the other guy's virgin daughter. She apparently wasn't thrown outside. They raped her and abused her all night until morning. Let her go at dawn. The woman arrived back at daybreak, sprawled out on the doorstep of the house where her master was staying until it became light. Now that is tragic, and you have a... Oh, sorry, I read ahead there. You have this kind of apparent trade going on. When the Levite threw out his concubine to save his own life, he's really trading his socially unacceptable theological principles, because they don't fly in that culture, for the socially acceptable code of hospitality. Does that make sense? He's like, okay, I'm a Levite, and let's just say he's got some thoughts about God. He's like, the thoughts I have about God just don't fit in this environment. So I'm going to put those on the shelf, and I'm going to go ahead and embrace the cultural way of living, hospitality. And according to that cultural way of living, honey, come here. Go outside. Boom, slam the door. And we just can't fathom that, okay? Now, it's starting to become clear, like in verse 2, why she left him. I think there's issues here, all right? But at the same time, it's tragic because he's bought into hospitality to such the extent that this is a legitimate, in his eyes, this is legit. This is what you do. So ladies, if you think you have it really bad, hang out in Judges 19 for a while, okay? It's a different world. And I just can't imagine, did she fight? Did she protest? And did he physically force her out the door and shut the door? I can't understand. That's why I'm saying I read this stuff and I understand hospitality is that important, but I just can't get there. In my head, I just can't get there, but that's the way it was. All right. Anyway, there's a couple of good quotes here. A prof of mine at seminary, Howard Hendricks, said, "The more you are like the culture, the less you can impact it for Christ." So there's a continuum of culture, and if you're so different from culture, well, that's great. You may be spotless and blameless, but it's probably, you have no audience. Nobody knows you. You're sitting in a cave for 40 years being unstained by the world. Great. But you have no audience. If you're so much like your culture, you have no message. Why is your message any different than it? You know what I mean? So it's this continuum, and I believe God calls us to be different spots in the continuum. I don't think there's one place for everybody, but anyway, not that I'm a relativist, I'm not, but don't have time to explain that, so we'll move on. And here's another great quote. I love this. "It is no feat to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." See, that gives me hope. If people think I'm weird, well, maybe that's not so bad. Now, we don't need people to go out and be weird just to be weird. There's a lot of that. I'm saying if I'm following biblical principles and I'm living a way that is intentional and it's strange to somebody who doesn't know Jesus, I'm good with that. I have no problem with that. You see what I'm saying? It's no big accomplishment to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. In other words, I get nervous when the culture applauds me, if that would happen. Like, oh, well, I got a problem here. I'm not sure I want that, okay? All right. So, moving on. Here are a quick couple examples of men spending their wives for their own protection. Remember the story about Abraham? Abraham's story here, he goes out, there's a famine, he goes down to Egypt, and he says, "Okay, honey, here's the deal. You're real beautiful, and they're going to want to, take you, and so can you just say you're my sister so that it may be well with me?" Look at the text. "And I might live on your account." He is viewing Sarah in the same way as the Levite viewed the concubine. You're a currency that can provide me with safety. Isn't that amazing? Wow. Same thing, Genesis 20. You don't have to read all that, but basically Abimelech, different scene, same kind of thing. He says, "She's my sister." So Abimelech is like, "Great, I'll take her." And Abimelech didn't go anywhere near her, and God shows up to Abimelech in a dream and says, "You're about a dead man, because that's a married woman." And Abimelech then goes to Abraham, "What are you doing to me? I had no idea. I didn't touch her, but God showed me in a dream." And in this little story, it's funny because you have Abimelech, a pagan king who doesn't, from the text, doesn't know God, is acting with more integrity than Abraham. Abimelech is the one that's hearing from God. Abimelech is the one that's responding to God. Abraham's trying to do his manipulation there. Anyway, so we have a pattern of men viewing women as a currency to protect themselves. So clearly in this story, the Levite doesn't really love the woman. He would have protected her, would have saved her, all right? The whole book of Judges, women go from being cared for to being killed by Israelites. So Caleb, he gets he blesses his daughter with a strong marriage. And then you go down to Deborah and Barak. Deborah, because there's a lack of male leadership, Deborah has to go out and fight. And Barak is like, "Well, I'll follow you if you go." And nothing wrong with Deborah doing this and that, but the real silence is where are the men. And then you've got chapter 9 is interesting because the text is a certain woman, like just some random woman, killed the bad guy. And it says very clearly, all the leaders and elders of the city were in the tower. They couldn't figure out what to do. It had some everyday woman. She knew what to do. You get the sense that men are kind of imploding here, but then the woman has to deliver. Then Jephthah goes off and kills his daughter to be powerful and popular. Well, this is kind of, then he's the deliverer of Israel. Then, of course, Samson and Delilah, she is dealing with Samson and bringing him ultimately to his death. And finally, in this last section here, Israelite women are raped, kidnapped, and killed by Israelites. So you have a decline of treatment in the story here, and this is where we are in chapter 17. All right, so here's what happens next. The master gets up in the morning, he opens the door of his house, and he went outside to start on the journey. There's the woman, his concubine, his secondary wife, sprawled out on the doorstep with her hand on the threshold, and you can just see that desperate desire for protection behind the door, right? She's going to the door, and throughout the story it says he opened the door of his house, and so he's been secure and safe from spending her to save his own life. So you get that metaphor, that door. She's trying to get to that door inside to security, can't do that. And he said, "Get up, let's leave." That's interesting. But there's no response. He put her on the donkey, went home. When they went home, he took a knife, grabbed his secondary wife, his concubine, carved her up into 12 pieces. It doesn't say for 12 tribes of Israel, but that's the implication here. He sent the pieces throughout Israel. Everyone saw the sight and said, "Nothing like this has happened, have been witnessed during the time of Israel, and take notice, speak up, discuss, what's going on?" Okay. This is the part that typically you don't have like a 6-year-old Sunday school class about this passage. It's kind of heavy. So her hand is on the threshold. She's trying to get back, and he is disrespecting his wife. As I was studying this passage, I could not figure out how this guy thinks, because I'm not impressed by his character, right, up to this point. But all of a sudden, he does this thing that results in a great unification of Israel. Israel comes together for the first times in the book of Judges, and they actually start to notice evil, and they discuss it, and they're trying to do what's right. So I'm like, I don't get it, how this guy who's not a good guy, what happens in his head? In other words, why does he cut her up? I don't get it. And I may be wrong here. I'm just going to share with you some observations from the text. It seems to me that he's probably angry about his own disrespect, the lack of hospitality. He's probably angry about that, not so much about his wife's death. Get up, let's go. He's not concerned about that. So I think his anger and his issues come from his own disrespect. He wants to call attention to the social problems, not the moral problems. He's blind to any moral problems. He's probably, I think, upset about the social, the lack of disrespect and hospitality. It's like, this is completely unacceptable. You've treated me in a bad way. Oh, yeah, and you killed her too. But I was disrespected. Okay, I think that's kind of where he's coming from, all right? But then externally, he does these things to awaken Israel and to stir everyone to action. And there's, archaeologically, they found some other documents that talk about taking a prisoner, dismembering him, and transporting the parts in order that the people would fear and gather quickly. So there is precedent for that kind of mindset in this culture, kind of an R-rated culture, right? Whatever his motives, isn't it ironic that this messed up, angry, prideful, whatever label, Levite was able to do what none of the judges were able to do? I find that fascinating. These other judges come and they just kind of trip over themselves and fall, and there's some relief, but there's no national unified event to come together and talk to God, which happens after this passage. So I think there's some hope here, because it's kind of like Rahab or Jephthah. He kills his daughter to be a hero. Rahab's a prostitute, kind of confused, but they show up in Hebrews 11. I'm like, well, I think I have a shot at this. I mean, And so here we've got this confused Levite that's angry and completely lost theologically and socially, so obscured he can't see straight, and yet God uses him to bring about national unification. I just find that interesting. In other words, remember last week the emphasis on grace? Here's a quote by John Calvin. "In every saint there's something to be found that's reprehensible. Although faith may be imperfect and incomplete, it does not cease to be approved by God." I look in the mirror and there's a long list of things that are reprehensible, but that doesn't wipe out my faith. That's why Rahab and Jephthah are in Hebrews 11, all right? Because it's not a big teeter-totter. Okay, 29 units of faith and 28 units of badness. Oh, barely, but okay. It's not measured that way, all right? So, it's ironic, but he comes in and he does accomplish unification. Which leads us back to the observations here that disappointment reminds us we're not in control. This guy didn't handle his disappointment well. He internalized the pain. He grew bitter like King David, and he held on to it. Disappointment is often linked to our expectations. If you haven't been disappointed yet, you will shortly. I guarantee it. All right? Could be trivial, like the toast is soggy, or it could be profound, like a relationship, husband, wife, kids, and you're disappointed, and that's painful. We bring our disappointment to Jesus. Why? Because he never disappoints us. He's the only one that will not disappoint us. All right? Lord, thank you for being good. Thank you for being trustworthy with our secrets, our sin, our pain, our bitterness, our anger. Perhaps there are seeds that have been sown in the past that we don't even know about. I pray that you bring those to our mind, that we can bring them to you, and we might have to bring them to you today, and then tonight, and then tomorrow morning, but eventually we want to just leave them with you and not grab them back like King David. I pray that there would be no bitterness, there would be no disappointment that could be a seed like that in our lives that grows and grows and blows up on our deathbeds. I pray that our last words would be gracious, that we'd be reflecting on your goodness, and that we would forgive those that have hurt us. And so guard us from the enemy's use of disappointment. I pray that disappointment could remind us that we're fragile, we're frail, we're loved by you, we're valued by you, and that through your Spirit who indwells us, we have the power of God to make good decisions and do things right. So would you be so kind to do that with us and through us? Amen.